Hello. I'm now going to continue my read-through of my book, The Baha'i Faith, A Short History. We've reached Chapter 11, Bahai Communities, from 1922 to the present. As before, I've divided the presentation into two separate videos for ease of recording. So, as with the previous chapter, it's important to emphasize that the book was first published in 1996 and therefore leaves out the past 25 years of development, which of course is quite crucial in relationship to the contents of this chapter. And for a slightly more up-to-date account, you should look at my Cambridge introduction, which came out in 2008. So the chapter is divided up into three sections. The first two I'll cover in this video and the third one in the second video. The first section is on the Islamic heartland, which is where the Baha'i faith originally expanded. That covers Iran, the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. The second section is on the West, which we can think of as the second world of Baha'i expansion, which covers North America, Europe, and the Anglo-Pacific. And then the third section is the third world of Baha'i expansion, which covers Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and the Pacific. So let's turn to the chapter. Baha'u'llah regarded himself as the promised redeemer for the whole human race. His message was universal. During Baha'u'llah's own lifetime, however, the Baha'i faith remained confined to a largely Islamic Middle Eastern milieu, and it was not until the ministry of Abdul-Baha that the situation began to change, largely through the establishment of Bahai communities in the West. This represented a very significant internationalization of the faith, but the actual number of Baha'is did not greatly increase, and Iranians remained in the majority. During the ministry of Shoghi Effendi, the actual diffusion of Baha'is in the world greatly increased as a result of the national teaching plans which he initiated from 1937 up to 1953. There was a growth in numbers, but until the early 1950s, the total number of Baha'is outside of Iran remained minute, perhaps 13,000 in all, with the United States being the only other country having a Baha'i community of even modest size. This stage in the faith's development continued essentially until the 10-year crusade from 1953 to 1963. The Iranian Baha'i community also grew, but by natural increase rather than new conversions, and by the 1950s was probably in the region of 200,000. I've got tables of statistics here, which obviously I'm not going to read. Since the 1950s, however, the situation has changed dramatically, and the Baha'i faith has begun to assume the dimensions of a world religion, albeit still small in size. Central to this has been a new pattern of sustained and rapid growth. Beginning with the 10-year crusade, the Baha'is have been able to attract large numbers of new believers, so that the total number of followers worldwide is now in the region of 5 million. These include Baha'i communities in almost every part of the world, a significant number of them large and well-rooted. Of the 5 million Baha'is, only 300,000 or so live in Iran, from comprising well over 90% of the total Baha'i population until at least the 1950s. The Iranian Baha'is now represent perhaps only 6 to 7%. Even if we include the extensive Iranian diaspora, it is clearly no longer possible to regard the Baha'i faith in primarily Iranian terms. The Baha'i faith has now expanded throughout the world, but the worldwide distribution of Baha'is is highly uneven. The distribution pattern has also changed markedly during recent years. To describe these complexities, it is useful to use a geocultural model of expansion. Until 1892, the Baha'i faith was still essentially confined to the Middle East and the Islamic world. Expansion in the West, beginning in 1894, represented a major cultural breakthrough and the beginning of the internationalization of the faith. There was then a slow process of establishing new Baha'i centers in other parts of the world, but until the 1950s, the Baha'i faith had in effect two axes: its traditional Islamic heartland, centered on Iran, and a second world, centered on the American Baha'i community, but including small numbers of Europeans and other Westerners, or those with a Western cultural background, such as members of the Latin American educated elite. Thus, by the early 1950s, of the 13,000 or so Baha'is who lived outside of the Middle East, an estimated 10,000 lived in the West. Similarly, by 1949, of 1,523 localities where Baha'is resided outside of the Middle East, 1,207 were in North America, 145 were in Europe and the Pacific, and only 169 were in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the rest of Asia combined. This pattern has now changed enormously, mainly because of a further cultural breakthrough into the world of the largely rural masses of the global south. Although diverse in their religious traditions and historical backgrounds in those areas where Baha'i expansion has occurred, these peoples have shown a remarkable similarity of response to those teachings. Their large numbers make them the predominant element in today's world Baha'i community. Thus, of over 120,000 localities in which Baha'is resided in 1992, only 1% were in the faith's Islamic heartland, 11% were in the West, and 88% were in the rest of the world, 31% in South Asia, 28% in Sub-Saharan Africa, 16% in Latin America and the Caribbean, 10% in Southeast Asia, 3% in Oceania, that's the Pacific, leaving out Australia and New Zealand, and only 1% in East Asia. Apart from greatly understating the presence of the faith in the Middle East, where a renewal of persecution has led to a major contraction in the recorded number of localities in Iran, these figures give a good indication of the present distribution of Baha'is in the world. And to emphasize that point, these are distribution of localities figures, not of actual Baha'i populations, which in some cases are not easy to work out exactly. So, turning to the Islamic heartland, which I've divided up into Iran, the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. After the collapse of Qajar rule in Iran, power was eventually consolidated in the hands of one of the army leaders who proclaimed himself as Reza Shah in 1925 and established a new dynasty, the Pahlavis. Notice, by the way, that there are several different ways of writing Reza in English because of different transliteration systems from Persian. This Pahlavi dynasty lasted until 1979, when it was overthrown and replaced by an Islamic republic. During the Pahlavi period, the government greatly increased the extent of centralized control over all elements of Iranian society and pursued policies of secular modernization and development. For the Baha'is, Pahlavi rule at first seemed to offer an end to their sufferings, with the government limiting the power of the ulama to incite persecution. Seeing themselves as agents for the revitalization of Iran and opposed to clerical power, the Baha'is welcomed a regime that appeared to have similar objectives. The divergent aims of the government and the Baha'is were vividly illustrated in 1934, however, when the government ordered the closure of the prestigious Baha'i schools, which were also attended by children from non-Baha'i families, independent institutions of any kind were now suspect, and as the Baha'is offered what was in effect an alternative ideology of modernization, such schools were not to be encouraged. Neither were the Baha'is given any official recognition, and while individual Baha'is were co-opted to work for the regime in various capacities, including Muhammad Reza Shah's doctor, for example, and the community as a whole was generally allowed to consolidate its institutions in private, the Baha'is lost the opportunities they had earlier enjoyed to present their beliefs openly to some sections of the Iranian public. Baha'is as individuals also suffered from their lack of civil status, being unable to contract legal marriages or validly complete government forms. Moreover, the government tolerated the development of well-organized anti-Baha'i propaganda and secret societies to which the Baha'is had no means of reply. Government-sponsored persecution also occurred, most notably in 1955, when nationwide anti-Baha'i pogroms were encouraged, seemingly as a sop to right-wing Islamic groups. In these circumstances, growth of the Baha'i faith in Iran beyond its existing communities became extremely limited. Internal development proceeded apace, however, with the consolidation and extension of the system of elected assemblies, including an elected National Spiritual Assembly from 1934 onwards, the settlement of Baha'i pioneer teachers in towns and villages throughout Iran, as well as in a number of other countries, particularly in the Middle East, and the furtherance of Baha'i community goals, including the development of a comprehensive system of religious instruction for Baha'i youth, the collection and reproduction of Baha'i scripture and other literature, and the attainment of literacy by almost all Baha'i women. There is as yet little systematic research on the social composition of the Baha'i faith in Iran at this time, but it would appear that the community as a whole tended towards an upward social mobility, in part as a consequence of the high value which Baha'is place on literacy, modern education, and the advancement of women. The fall of the Shah and the establishment of the Islamic Republic in 1979 ushered in a period of massive persecution for the Baha'is. Within a few years, over 200 Baha'is had been executed or murdered, and hundreds more arrested. Baha'i properties were confiscated, graveyards and shrines destroyed, and thousands of Baha'is were discharged from work and their children dismissed from school and universities. In 1983, the government banned Baha'i activities and made membership of spiritual assemblies a criminal offense. All Baha'i institutions were disbanded and have not yet been reformed, although varying in intensity as moderate and extremist factions within the government have vied for power. The threat to the Iranian Baha'is remains very real. Some 10,000 Baha'is have fled and been resettled in other countries, but the mass of Iranian Baha'is remain. Ironically, far from destroying the Baha'i community, the Iranian persecutions appear to have stiffened Baha'i resolve, both within Iran and elsewhere. Certainly, they have led to a major increase in public awareness of the faith worldwide and have provoked extensive sympathy and support, including from individual governments, the European Union, and the United Nations. These are photographs of attacks on two Baha'i properties in Iran. On the left, the destruction of the dome of the National Baha'i Center in 1955, and on the right, the destruction of the House of the Bab in Shiraz in 1979. And then we have the members of the Baha'i National Spiritual Assembly who disappeared in August 1980 and are presumed to be dead. And on the right we have one of a number of Baha'i cemeteries desecrated and destroyed since the revolution. Let's turn now to the Middle East and North Africa. Baha'i expansion outside of Iran in this region has always been extremely limited. During the period of Shoghi Effendi's ministry, the Egyptian Baha'i community was very active, even in the face of anti-Baha'i agitation. One instance of this led to the legal declaration in 1925 that the Baha'is were not Muslims, a pronouncement that Shoghi Effendi seized upon as evidence of the faith's emancipation and independence from Islam. In Iraq, meanwhile, Baha'i activity remained constrained. The Baha'is were few in number, and the local Shi'is were powerful and vocal in their opposition. Their seizure of Baha'u'llah's house in Baghdad during the 1920s became a cause célèbre in which the newly established Iraqi government defied all pressure from the League of Nations, whose mandates commission had condemned the seizure as unlawful. Elsewhere, small groups of Iranian Baha'i pioneers established themselves in various parts of the Arab world, but circumstances did not permit more than the most cautious teaching endeavors, even in countries with more liberal religious attitudes. Only in secular Turkey was open Baha'i activity eventually possible. The situation in most of the Arab world became more difficult for Baha'is in the post-World War II period, in part because of suspicions engendered by the location of the Baha'i World Center in what had now become Israel. Particularly damaging was an Egyptian presidential decree of 1960, which banned all Baha'i activities and was followed by intermittent periods of persecution. Baha'i activities were also banned in Iraq in 1970, whilst in Morocco there was a short period of persecution in which several Baha'is were actually sentenced to death. That was in 1962, until widespread international appeals persuaded the authorities to exercise tolerance. This is now Central Asia and the Caucasus. In the immediate aftermath of the Russian revolutions of 1917, the Baha'i communities in Asiatic Russia had expanded their activities and begun to teach ethnic Russians. They were opposed by the communists, however, and the Baha'is found themselves under increasing pressure as the new communist government became more stridently anti-religious in its policies. From 1928 onwards, there was a build-up of anti-Baha'i activity, including the arrest and exile of leading Baha'is, the banning of their organizations, the closure of their schools and libraries, and the expropriation of the Ashgabat temple. There was a renewal of persecution in 1938, including mass arrests and deportations that effectively destroyed the early Baha'i communities of Russian Central Asia and the Caucasus. The temple was later demolished after being damaged in an earthquake. Only following the collapse of communism in the 1990s have Baha'i activities resumed in what are now independent republics. Success has been modest but sustained, and stable Baha'i communities have been established, in some cases including individual survivors from the earlier period. Now let's turn to the West, which covers North America, Europe, and the Anglo-Pacific. North America. The American Baha'is remain the largest and most important of the Western Baha'i communities. During the 1920s, a joint American and Canadian National Spiritual Assembly replaced the earlier Baha'i Temple unity, and under Shoghi Effendi's guidance, pioneered many of the aspects of the modern system of Baha'i administration. Its exercise of increasingly comprehensive control over Baha'i activities was resented by some of the more individualistically inclined Baha'is. By the 1930s, however, the new style of organization had gained general acceptance, and the Baha'is embarked on a series of teaching plans to extend and expand their community, as well as to establish Baha'i communities in Latin America under the first North American 7-year plan from 1937 to 1944. After World War II, the American Baha'is, North American Baha'is, were also directed by Shoghi Effendi to help establish new Bahai communities in Europe. Despite extensive activity, growth within North America remained limited, so that there were still only about 5,000 Baha'is by 1947. Growth in Canada increased after the establishment of an independent Baha'i administration there in 1948, eventually coming to include a significant number of Baha'is of American Native Indian background. The long-running project to construct a Baha'i house of worship in the Chicago suburb of Wilmette was finally completed in 1953. As in other parts of the West, significant Baha'i expansion in North America only began from the late 1960s onwards, with the attraction of large numbers of youth and minority group members, particularly African Americans from poor rural areas of the southern states. These large-scale conversions raised the total number of Baha'is to over 100,000 by the early 1970s, and subsequent growth may have come close to doubling that figure. Given that in previous years the American Baha'i community was predominantly middle class and white, both these influxes had a major impact on cultural and administrative style, leading, for example, to a much greater emphasis on music and other performing arts, and to a relaxation of the requirement that those wanting to join the community have high levels of knowledge about the faith. More diversity was introduced during the 1980s with the large influx of Iranian Baha'i refugees. Europe. Although Baha'i communities were established in Britain, France, and Germany from the turn of the century, they remained extremely small. National spiritual assemblies were formed in Britain and Germany in 1923, and in 1925 an International Baha'i Bureau was established in Geneva, which provided both a Baha'i presence at the League of Nations and some measure of coordination for European Baha'i activities. Association with the Esperanto movement and the teaching tours of the American Baha'i lecturer Martha Root led to the Baha'i faith becoming better known in many parts of the continent. Root was able to attract the Dowager Queen Marie of Romania to the faith, and Lydia Zamenhof, the daughter of the Esperanto movement's founder, also became a Baha'i. Until the Nazi regime came to power in 1933, Germany was the most active centre, but the faith was subsequently banned there because of its international and pacifist teachings. Thereafter, Baha'i activities in most of Europe ceased during the horrific disruptions of World War II. The one exception to this was Britain, where there seems to have been little Baha'i activity until the 1930s, but an increasing range of accomplishments from then onwards, including the adoption of an American-style teaching plan in 1944, when the war was still at its height. This is a photograph of the eminent American Baha'i teacher Martha Root, who played a major role in spreading the Baha'i teachings in Europe during the interwar period. And these are two of the best-known European Baha'is from that time: Lydia Zamenhof, the Polish Baha'i Esperantist and daughter of the founder of Esperanto, and Queen Marie of Romania. After the war, American assistance ensured a rapid resumption and extension of Baha'i activity in Western continental Europe. The German Baha'i administration was re-established in 1946-47, and during the 10-year crusade, from 1953 to 63, new Baha'i national assemblies were established throughout most of Western Europe. The British Baha'is, meanwhile, were directed by Shoghi Effendi towards a more global role and successfully coordinated a 2-year project to establish the faith in sub-Saharan Africa. That was in 1951-53. London also became the burial place of Shoghi Effendi following his death there in 1957, and was later the site of the first International Baha'i Congress, held to celebrate the completion of the 10-year crusade and the election of the Universal House of Justice in 1963. A Baha'i house of worship was opened in Frankfurt in Germany in 1964. As in North America, larger scale growth in Europe only started from the late 1960s, again involving significant numbers of new Baha'is in their teens and early 20s, and presumably reflecting developments in the increasingly independent youth culture throughout the West. The actual numbers involved were quite low, however, from approximately 1,400 Baha'is in 1952 to perhaps 17,000 by the early 1970s and 25,000 by the late 1980s. The question of why growth of the Baha'i faith in most of Europe has been so much slower than in North America remains unanswered. The Baha'i history of Eastern Europe has been very different from that of the West. There were Baha'is in European Russia during the time of Abdu'l-Baha, but their activities came to a stop after the imposition of communist rule in 1917. Again, there was some Baha'i activity in parts of Eastern Europe during the 1920s and 1930s, but this could not be resumed after World War II and the establishment of communist regimes in that region. In any case, there were very few Baha'is. This all changed dramatically following the collapse of communism in most of these countries in 1989-91, and since then Baha'i communities have rapidly developed in almost all of the states of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and the former Soviet Union. The only exceptions are in some parts of the war-torn former Yugoslavia. Remember, this book was published in the 1990s. Most of these new Baha'i communities are quite small, but two, those of Albania and Romania, have experienced such rapid growth as to make them the largest in the whole of Europe. Finally, let's turn to the Anglo-Pacific. Baha'i activities in Australia and New Zealand began in the early 1920s. Early growth was extremely limited despite a flurry of activities during the 1930s, including the establishment of a joint national spiritual assembly in 1934. As late as 1951, there were still only 400 Baha'is. Despite their low numbers, they were directed to help open the island groups of the Pacific to the faith during the 10-year crusade. A Baha'i house of worship for the Pacific region was dedicated near Sydney in 1961. As in North America and Western Europe, more rapid growth, spearheaded by youth, began from the late 1960s, and by the late 1980s, Baha'i numbers had increased to perhaps 10,000. So many thanks to my patrons and to all of you who've been listening. If you want to support my channel, you're very welcome to like the video and subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos, and if you want to offer practical support via Patreon or PayPal, links below, that will be very much appreciated. Thank you again and have a good day.